How's the weather up there today?
It just got cold as of this morning. It's been like 70s and really nice, and then dropped to the 50s. So still not too bad, but a little chilly.
It's a little rainy, but it's 70 here. 70 something.
Yeah.
I'm great with the pre-presentation small talk, by the way. How's the weather up there and all that?
You know, check off the boxes of what you're supposed to ask, right?
Good group here. All right, well, maybe we'll do a little bit of an introduction. Want to say welcome to Dr. Blue for joining us today. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise and Sport Science at UNC Chapel Hill. Done a lot of really cool, exciting research stuff that's near and dear to my heart with body composition. And I'm excited to hear her speak today on diversity and racial potential disparities in body composition. She's examined cardiometabolic health and expanded over into performance and football, linemen, all kinds of really cool topics. Stuff that I complain about in my class all the time. She's the one out there answering all the questions. So we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. How this will work is you'll give the presentation, we'll open up to questions, and then I think at the end, all the faculty members and all the stuffy people will jump off and have you spend a little bit of time with the students, and they can ask you questions without us bothering everybody. So appreciate it. Looking forward to the talk, and the show is all yours.
Yeah, great, thanks. Just to make sure, can I share my screen? Am I don't know if I need to be a host. Do I have access to do that?
I think he probably made you co-host. Let's give it a shot.
Okay.
Looks good.
All right. Looks like you can see it.
Yep.
All right, perfect. So first, just want to say thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about some of the topics you mentioned. So in particular, I'm going to keep the focus of this talk around body composition and some validity within just some thoughts and ideas on application. First, I wanted to give just a little bit of background about myself. So I am pretty much North Carolina, tried and true here. Not originally from here, but been here since I started my undergrad, and have moved a little bit throughout the state. Worked at High Point University, which is a smaller private school in North Carolina, before ultimately coming back as an assistant professor at UNC. And so had some really cool experiences and gotten to know the North Carolina community, which has been a big fun part of my research. So then just a little bit of background, like you mentioned, but predominantly have looked at body composition and muscle characteristics, particularly looking at some normative data in different populations, if certainly the validity of our devices, and that is the big piece I'll talk about today, but then have done some fun work with high intensity interval training, some resistance training in different populations. More recently have started working in some athlete wellness and readiness, working in conjunction with some biomechanists and looking at injury risk there. So, kind of in any of these realms towards the end of the talk with questions, I'm kind of happy to answer things that's outside of what I've talked about today. So just initially wanted to upfront talk about body composition, right? And so, I have a habit of doing this even too, of saying, percent fat and body composition and kind of using them interchangeably. But I always like to point out that recognizing that our body composition is going to incorporate several different compartments and constituents of the body. And there's a lot of different metrics and outcome variables that we can assess and look at. And, one or the other may be a better indicator of cardiometabolic disease risk, if that's your focus. One may be better for injury risk or prevention, return to play metric, if that's kind of your area. And so just recognizing that there's quite a broad spectrum when we're talking about body composition. So like I alluded to a little bit there, has the potential, of course, to influence our current and future health, performance, injury risk, how we set up different interventions, and rehabilitation programs. And so, my focus has predominantly been looking more in regards with current and future health, but certainly some work with performance as well. So, reason being why I've kind of had that focus on the relationship with cardiometabolic health is that there's quite a few mechanisms when we start to break down what all excess fat accumulation can potentially lead to. And so, not just excess fat, but also specific fat distribution patterns. So particularly visceral adipose tissue, so that fat that surrounds your organs, and in that idea of abdominal adiposity, we see that it really can increase our cytokines and inflammatory response, lead to more insulin resistance, see some vascular inflammation and vascular dysfunction there with lesions. And so, we kind of have this obesity that's, our central component that leads to these different cardiometabolic conditions. And so, why for me in particular, I focus on racial and ethnic minorities is that certainly we see this unfortunate health disparity in our country where our racial and ethnic minority populations have this heightened risk of different diseases. And so, in particular, thinking about diabetes, I apologize, depending on your screen size, it might be a little bit small, but we see for our racial and ethnic minorities almost double the prevalence of diabetes in comparison to our white-only populations, with, a heightened risk in our African-American in particular and Mexican-American individuals. So certainly something that, calls for additional research. And then this is showing total cardiovascular disease and just recognizing that we do see a heightened prevalence in our African-American individuals in particular. This particular chart is from the American Heart Association. So they consider obesity, they look predominantly at BMI. And so with using body mass index as their metric, it shows certainly for our racial and ethnic minority females, our Black and Hispanic females are at a really heightened prevalence of overweight and obesity, as well as our Hispanic males in particular. And so speaking of body mass index, feel like kind of a traditional exercise physiologist where I don't love it, but I try to have the research to back that up, right? So this was kind of collating a lot of data from our laboratory, looking at body mass index and percent fat measured by the DEXA. And it was in about 800 subjects, and we looked to see, that association, how much of our body mass index is actually capable of explaining the variance in percent body fat. And, what we see is that really across the board, it's a pretty low correlation with, even in our Caucasian population, BMI only explaining about 27% of the variance in percent fat, and then that drops to 25% in our African American individuals, and then down to about 16% in our Asian American individuals. And so our African American and Asian are actually the two populations that get flagged the most in terms of misclassification of your body composition if we're just particularly looking at a body mass index. And so for an idea of application, I always kind of like to bring this image up, just recognizing, if we have two individuals that are going to walk into a clinic or to see their doctor, and, typical, we measure height and weight. Our, 29-year-old Black female here is going to be categorized as 30 BMI, which will put her in the obese category. And then our 20-year-old Hispanic and Caucasian female will be classified at normal weight. Her BMI is 22.6. But when we look at the percent fat metric there, we can see that there's less than a 1% difference between the two. And that's, particularly interesting, even thinking that our Black female is 9 years older, and we do expect to see there to be an increase with age. And so, these two clinic visits are going to be really different for two individuals who have similar body fat percentages. Likely our 29-year-old female is going to receive feedback of, she needs to start a weight loss intervention. She needs to start, some kind of diet or nutrition consultation. She'll likely receive additional feedback, blood work, and require more feedback in that way. And, you know, so there's pros and cons to that. It may, you know, catch something that might have been missed. However, it also, you know, potentially is providing more of a stress and burden on this particular individual when, you know, we have another female, our 20-year-old who, you know, on the other side of things, she might be missed. Her percent body fat may be putting her at risk for some cardiometabolic concerns, and likely wouldn't have that same follow-up or same type of interaction with her visit at the clinic. And so, you know, just that argument that if we are going to use it to classify individuals and to create recommendations, that you know, we really need to look a little deeper. And so how would we do that then? So, you know, particularly in our laboratory, our criterion method that we will use to say is the gold standard of body composition estimates is going to be our 4-compartment model. And so that allows us to look at those different constituents of the body a little bit more in depth. So we'll get body volume, total body water, and bone mineral content. That's what that MO stands for. And so we have different methods of doing that. I would say, you know, criterion best practice that we can do is to use deuterium dilution or an isotope tracer to measure total body water. But then it's been validated that our 4-compartment model can also be used with using a bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy device to measure total body water. And also I would point out that for body volume, I have the BOD pod, but could certainly use underwater weighing as well to get your body volume estimate. And so, you know, those are usually used as our gold standard that we then will compare other devices to ensure that those results are going to be accurate. And so one newer model that, you know, I'll talk about looking at the validity of it is a more rapid 4-compartment model that allows you to cut out one device of the BOD pod and calculate body volume based on some DEXA values. And so, you know, that, you know, is exciting as we look at that more and make sure that it's valid because it, you know, has the potential to be a little bit more cost effective. You don't need another device and a little bit more time efficient, so that other laboratories that maybe don't have all of the devices would be capable of using a 4-compartment model. So then just, you know, some of our other devices really here, just recognizing there's a couple models of DEXA devices you can use using that low dose X-ray to get the different densities of our body. But then we have, you know, quite a few bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy and analysis devices that are going to measure our total body water and then estimate our fat-free mass from there. And so, you know, one of the things that I look at is, you know, with these single device estimates of body composition, what we most likely are doing is really just breaking the body down into fat mass and fat-free mass. So, you know, we're not looking at all of these constituents like we are with the multi-compartment model, and we're just breaking it down into our 2 compartments. And so, you know, the concern with that is that there are some assumptions that these devices are going to rely on in order for us to make sure that we have valid results. And so, you know, why do we evaluate validity is because we want to ensure that we're maintaining these assumptions. And so, particularly with our BOD pod or measures of body volume, we are looking at, you know, how much air we displace, measuring volume from there, and then calculating a body density based on our mass. And so with that, we have to assume that we have kind of a constant density of our fat mass and fat-free mass. With our bioelectrical impedance analysis devices, so, you know, it's going to send a current through the body and measure water, but it only sends at one frequency if it's analysis. And so, you know, it's going to rely on population characteristics and algorithms that have been pre-programmed into the device to give us our accurate estimates there. And so certainly if we're in a diverse sample and we want to have, you know, individuals of different age and race and ethnicities included, then that can be of concern for our validity there. And then bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy devices, while they don't rely on population characteristics, they still are, it's a current that's assuming it's traveling through a specific distance based on your height. And so body proportion as well as body density can be impacted there. And so kind of as the group that I flag generally is going to be our density of fat-free mass, the characteristics, of course, and then proportion and density of things that you would want to check and make sure before you're using these devices to understand if we're going to have valid results. And so what the literature shows, and what I've seen with some of my work, is that in particular, our racial and ethnic minorities, overweight and obese individuals, and then athletes can violate these assumptions. And so that could potentially lead to inaccurate results. So just as an example of that, one of the studies that I was involved with, it actually used results from the NHANES data and looked at from DEXA and bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy devices. We were able to characterize fat-free mass a little bit more in depth, and with a large sample, able to evaluate if there were any racial or ethnic differences. And what we saw is that actually, in particular, for our density of fat-free mass and total body density, there were differences between our Black and white and Mexican American individuals. And so just something that we want to come back to and say, like, okay, well, if our racial and ethnic minorities are going to violate these assumptions potentially, then what's the problem is that it could potentially lead to this misclassification of overweight and obesity, and then subsequently miscategorize them for their disease risk. And it can be on either ends of the spectrum, right? So it can be that we maybe overestimate their risk or underestimate their risk. Both, of course, could be problematic. So kind of initially where I started with this is more in an overweight and obese population. And so, recognizing in exercise physiology, it's particularly we do work in overweight and obese and looking at how different interventions may impact body composition. So want to make sure that if we are going to take a step and use different body composition models, that it's accurate. And so this was looking at that rapid or modified 4-compartment model version where the DEXA body volume values were used. And that was then compared to our criterion where we used the BOD pod for body volume. And it was actually, exciting to see that those body volume calculations from the DEXA held up, and it allowed for us to have accurate estimates of body composition in this overweight population. We saw good standard error of the estimate and total error values that, indicated to us based on our validity statistics that it would be an accurate estimate of body composition. One thing that we did see, and that, when looking at the validity of body composition devices, you want to make sure that you check for proportional bias and recognize how, depending on what their body fat percentage is and where they kind of fell on the spectrum, how that could impact the accuracy of their results. And so, we saw that as our individuals increased more in fat mass and lean mass together, we saw, a greater overestimation of fat mass from this model and underestimation of lean mass in this particular model. And so some certainly things you want to make note of depending on the population that you are working with. And then I wanted to talk about this particular study that we looked at a 3-dimensional body scanner, just to make note of, in the body composition world, there's always new and fun technology, and it's interesting. And this one in particular is going to give you a 3D image of your body. You can even get the printout and go print a 3D version of yourself, which is neat. However, we wanted to, look in a more multi-ethnic sample and see, is it going to give us valid results? And so this simply is using circumference measurements of the body. and then putting it into an algorithm and calculating a percent body fat from there. And so in comparison to our 4-compartment model, it gave us high error estimates, high total error, high standard error of the estimate. Overall, we would say this was a poor estimate of body composition. And so while, neat and exciting, and I do think, they've gone back and maybe updated their algorithm some, so it's always evolving. But, as it stood, as it, came to market, this particular device was not shown to be accurate. And then just another realm of things, depending on your particular focus and interest, we did have looked at the validity of appendicular or limb body composition estimates using bioelectrical impedance. So this was particularly looking at a device, the InBody 770, and looking to see if it would validly estimate our arm and leg mass compared to a DEXA. And what we saw is that, unfortunately, it's really going to underestimate those particular values in an athletic population. And there was a really big proportional bias, recognizing that athletes kind of are going to fall across quite a diverse spectrum depending on their particular sport. And so we saw the greatest in the figures on this particular screen now is showing the big bias that we had depending on, we had cross-country athletes and football athletes. And so our individuals that had, really high amounts of lean mass saw really big underestimations of their values when using the bioelectrical impedance device. So certainly something you would want to be wary of if you're using it for programming and things of that nature, or normative data. You would certainly not want to compare the in-body results to the DEXA for appendicular measures. So then getting into kind of, where I sit now, looking in particular at racial and ethnic minorities, did a study looking at 110 adults and was able to include a pretty diverse group of individuals here of Asian, African-American, Hispanic, Caucasian, and then multiracial individuals, people who identified with more than one race. And so what we saw here was that I evaluated, compared to our 4C criterion using deuterium dilution, we saw that our multi-compartment models all held up really, really well in our multi-ethnic sample, all as together in the sample, as well as, within each race individually. And so, that was exciting to see. If you have access to these pieces of equipment, whether it was a 4-compartment model or a 3-compartment model, it gave really good, accurate results. Additionally, here we see that there was some proportional bias, but for the most part, it was relatively narrow limits of agreement. So for our individual variability, we didn't see as big of a spread as we see with some of our single device estimates. So the multi-compartment model certainly would still be the recommendation from my point of view if you have access to these particular pieces of equipment. So then looking at the single devices, so our BOD pod and our DEXA, they actually showed really good error results as well. So they were low and would indicate to us that they would be good measures of body composition in a multi-ethnic sample and in each race. And so the in-body was just a little bit, I would say, below that, a little bit higher of error. But we actually saw that our bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy device had the highest amount of error, which is fairly interesting because it's actually really regularly used. And if you look in the literature, it really hasn't been validated in different races and ethnicities. And so it was interesting to see that, even in our Caucasian population, which we used more as a comparator, assuming that it would perform best in that population and in the algorithms were in body proportion and body density were based off of more of a Caucasian sample, we saw that it actually performed poorly as a metric for that particular population, as well as our African-American and multiracial individuals. So then when looking more again at that individual variability for this particular sample, what we saw is that certainly our bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy had the largest limits of agreement there, and quite a bit of proportional bias, and it really depended on if you were on the low end or the high end of the spectrum in terms of percent body fat, as if it was going to over or underestimate you. But what we saw for DEXA is that it actually more so was going to consistently overestimate. So there is some proportional bias, but regardless, it's probably going to give you a little bit of an overestimation. All of these values kind of hover above our 0 time point, right? And so it's all likely going to be a little bit of an overestimation. And our BOD pod is likely going to be more of an underestimation, kind of hovering under that 0 there. And then, as an important note, our in-body actually didn't show any proportional bias. And so, that was really exciting to see that there was a device that, potentially, regardless of if you have a really broad sample in terms of size, that it's not going to dictate how well this particular device performs. And so, those were some interesting markers that we pulled from that particular study. But ultimately, and this was really exciting to me, the validity results didn't vary significantly between races and ethnicities. If it performed just okay in one population, it was pretty much just okay in the rest. If it was, ideal in one, it was ideal through, the rest of the populations we looked at. And so, that's very encouraging in terms of that recognizing that our devices have kind of are up to date and robust enough to handle any small differences in fat-free mass characteristic or body proportion we might see, and that it's going to still allow for us to get valid results, and that you don't have to be as concerned with which device you select based on race and ethnicity. Now, of course, there's still ones that have more error than others, but you don't have to base it on if you have a multi-ethnic sample. And so just thinking more in terms of application, if you were going to select a device and use this in practice, what would I recommend? And so I have my little green is go and red stop, yellow, just think about it chart here. And so like I mentioned, for our multi-compartment models, all looked really good. Our DEXA and BOD pod, even though they estimated in different directions, overall, based on total error, I would say, you would feel comfortable selecting them. And so one note there, though, is certainly you wouldn't want to compare, because if our DEXA is overestimating and our BOD pod's underestimating, then it might look like those results are certainly very far from one another, when actually more of the accurate result is likely somewhere in the middle. But with this too, just again, that recognizing that you would want to kind of proceed with caution with using the bioelectrical impedance device in a multi-ethnic sample. And the in-body, may see a little bit less accurate results, but without having that proportional bias, you can feel confident, at least if you have a broad size spectrum in your study, including the in-body as your method of measuring body composition. And then here, just bringing in a couple of others, some that I talked about, some not, but just recognizing that the modified 4C in our multi-ethnic sample, it actually was, I would say, more in our yellow category of proceed with caution. So just would want to recheck that, even though it was accurate or overweight and obese. If you have a more diverse sample, it may be something that you would want to confirm or check the validity of first. We did see in our 3D body scanner, not necessarily as it stood at that time was accurate. We have also looked at the ultrasound and using that, measuring fat thickness, similar as to you would for a skin fold in the 7 skin fold sites, and looking at that in an overweight and obese population. So they were good and acceptable, but still would be something you'd want to proceed with caution to some degree if you're thinking about using the ultrasound as a means for measuring body composition. And then if you're looking at limb specific values, I would say right now the DEXA is probably still going to be your best bet there, and not necessarily using bioelectrical impedance devices for that. So then just thinking of other things to consider, right, like outside of our population, just recognizing what model is going to give you the most information. And so if you have the ability to do multi-compartment models, then you have, access to a lot of these different variables. And I have my little asterisk here because right now you would need to incorporate the DEXA to measure those, but most of our multi-compartment models do include the DEXA. And so this would be something where you could expand your particular outcome variables that you're looking at. And so here, that's my mention. I have a love-hate relationship with the DEXA. I certainly don't think it's the gold standard, but it does provide a lot of information, and you can use it in a lot of really neat and unique ways. And so, with that, thinking through, what information can I get from each device? And then what variables am I most interested in? And then selecting something from there. And so, fat distribution in particular. So the newer DEXA models are updated where you can look at visceral adipose tissue. You can also use an ultrasound to measure visceral adipose tissue. And that, with its relationship that's been shown to cardiometabolic health, if that's a particular interest, that could be the direction or the devices that you choose. And so actually that's more the direction that I am currently going. So with, future research looking at how visceral adipose tissue measured with these two particular devices relates to some vascular aging and in vascular inflammation in multi-ethnic populations, as well as then looking at a multi-ethnic sample of pregnant females and then how their body composition changes into postpartum. And so I'll be using ultrasound and DEXA only in the postpartum portion. But, that's an exciting kind of upcoming project of, using what information I can get from different body composition devices and how can we look at that to correlate more to some of these other metabolic and cardiovascular health components. And so, that's kind of my direction that I'm headed, but also recognizing, if you have an interest in older females or just older individuals, individuals who experience a stress fracture, limb differences, then you could also, pull out these other body composition variables and look at those from the different devices. So then just a couple other things to consider, recognizing that sometimes cost is going to be an important piece. And so that's always, an angle that I feel like you have to mention, recognizing that the DEXA can be quite expensive as well as the bod pod. And so, that's a lot of times why we use our bioelectrical impedance devices, but understanding that, if you have access to a bod pod and a bioelectrical impedance device, that 3C model that you could create there is actually going to give you really accurate results, and potentially using both as opposed to just one or the other would give you your best estimates, particularly if you're in a more broad multi-ethnic sample. And in state regulations, I did put in there because I feel like it's another thing that you have to acknowledge, that X-ray devices can be a little bit trickier depending on the state that you're in. So just something else you would have to think about if using these different devices in application. So then just kind of my concluding thoughts of, what I've done so far is that most current technology is going to be capable of accurately assessing body compositions in our different races and ethnicities. Like I said, they seem to be robust enough to be able to handle any of these small differences within body proportion or density. And so, that's exciting. Of course, there's still maybe use some caution for a couple of the different devices. And as new equipment is created, that I would always suggest checking the validity of it first before, implementing it. But right now, it seems like we're trending very well, that things are working in our multi-ethnic populations, which is, like I said, exciting to see, because you don't have to base your selection of body composition device on what population you're working with in that way. And then just my other plug, I feel like, is, we should make the effort to select the device that makes the most sense for our research question and clinical practice, which seems, like a little bit of an obvious statement, but I think that we tend to fall back on, what we're used to. And like I mentioned, you might just use the bioelectrical impedance device because it's commonly used. But if you have access to a bod pod and can create that 3C model, then that may give you a better result. And so, if body composition is a prime focus or a prime outcome variable for your study, then, I would recommend making the effort to look into the literature some and see what is going to be the most valid for your particular question and sample that you're working with. And so with that, I will take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. A lot of good information in there. Try not to nerd out and ask a bunch of questions myself. So do we have questions from others? I will say you covered my one where I was like, oh, I'm going to ask her if she thinks DEXA is the gold standard. So you preempted me on that one.
I feel like I always have to throw it in there.
Yeah. Does anyone else have questions?
Yes, I have a question. First of all, thank you for the great presentation, Dr. Blue. Really, very interesting. I'm not familiar too much in the literature of body composition, but my question to you is, do you know anywhere in the literature in terms of validity in different BIS systems? Since you mentioned that BIS is most commonly used when assessing body comp in laboratories, have you seen anywhere in the literature or in some of your research, validity between different BIS systems and how that could possibly affect looking into diverse populations as well?
So the BIS is an interesting device in concept because there are different ways that you can use bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy, but the actual way that the current travels through your body and then the calculation that they use to estimate it should be the same regardless for the most part. So what's going to be different is some of those things like potentially those pre-programmed resistivity coefficients and body proportion and body density estimates. And so what's neat about those devices, they do tend to give you access to what they include. And so you could adapt them or potentially try to find or create better values that are going to suit your sample better. So I would say when comparing the different BIS devices in particular, not a ton of literature specifically comparing them, but certainly looking at the validity of them compared to multi-compartment models, but just haven't been very inclusive samples that they've looked at with those particular studies. And so a lot of Caucasian males have been included in those studies. And so it's been shown to be valid, but not as generalizable. Does that answer your question? I kind of started on a couple paths there.
No, yeah, that did.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Of course, thanks.
So I'm really curious about the pre-postpartum sort of study that you mentioned that you're going down that. Also curious about how you, one, just because of the fluid shifts and all that sort of thing, sort of interesting, but how are you tackling that with the ultrasound as far as the abdominal adiposity? Is that what you're looking at there, or is it?
Mm-hmm. And it will actually be, that will be in postpartum as well. So we'll look at the 7-site skin folds in pregnancy and do those throughout. And predominantly the reason being is that's going to be one of our better devices to not have to account for the fluid shifts and to not have to as much and not have to, there's equations for the bod pod to use with pregnancy, but it's a little bit tricky, right? Because you can't separate the child from the mom. So anyway, so we're using the skin fold technique with the ultrasound throughout, but then in terms of the actual visceral adipose, that will be in the postpartum period.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember a long time ago, there was a certain ultrasound technique that they were using within the abdomen that was separated specifically for that, but I can't remember.
Specifically for pregnant women?
Not for pregnant women, just in general. I was just wondering.
In general, we've done it where we can get a metric, and we go from the linea alba to the base of the aorta, and we can get an estimate.
That is what I remember a specific tracing on there that was.
Yeah. We do that some now. Yeah.
With the 3D scanner stuff, right? So actually, they're about to buy one for the faculty and staff gym, and I think they already have one on campus for the campus rec. Sort of two questions. When they were determining the body fat percentage with that, is that based off of some sort of internal algorithm, or is it based off the body volume estimate?
It's an estimate of body volume from the circumference measurement. Yeah.
So I know you sort of hinted at that maybe they've improved and they're getting better. At this point, do you think they're useful for other purposes other than percent body fat?
I think certainly, I mean, it's tracking your circumference if you are wearing the same thing, because clothing is going to have a big impact on it. But if you're wearing the tight fitting clothing and you're consistently in something similar, then it would be able to track how your circumferences changed. And so, you know, I do think that there's some benefit in that, just not necessarily then the relationship of how it then calculates your percent body fat from there. And, you know, originally, I think a lot of devices were based off of DEXA results, thinking of it as the gold standard. And so, you know, I think that influenced how some of the things were generated. And then when comparing it to the 4C, I think that has been pushed potentially some adjustments to equations to try to make it a little more accurate in comparison to the 4C as opposed to the DEXA.
Sense. I don't know if it's too much of a leading question with some things, but have you run across anything with BIA and amputees on those lines?
In terms of accuracy of?
Yeah, or just like applications with electrical impedance, or actually any of the body comp devices you're using. Obviously, DEXA sort of would make sense as well. But.
You know, interestingly, I guess it would depend on if it was like a single or double amputee, because I would think that, you know, with the impediment, at least it's only traveling through the one side. And so it potentially would give you a value if you were doing it on the side where there wasn't an amputated limb, and you could get at least some estimate. But that's an interesting thought. I haven't particularly done anything in that realm.
Okay. It's the same thought process I had out loud the other day when we were doing it. So
it looks like there's a couple of chat questions. What does the process look like getting data from the DEXA relative to ultrasound? Let's see. When you're using a DEXA, you know, your individual is going to lay flat on their back. You know, the scan is going to take somewhere between the newer devices are exciting and take about 2 minutes. Some of them can take up to about 13, 14 minutes if you have a large and tall individual on there. And then, you know, after it does the scan, it'll give you an image that's showing mostly their bone and looking at bone density, and then their soft tissue mass. And then from there, it's able to differentiate the soft tissue mass into fat mass and fat-free mass. Or lean mass, I should say, depending on the densities or the attenuation of the X-ray. And so you would get a printout generally that's going to show you, based on regions of interest, what your lean mass, bone mass, and fat mass is going to be in the regions that you've selected. So that can be the trunk, it can be the arm, it can be the legs, or just your total body. And so that's why, I mean, it gives great information that you can break down regionally, which is really, really helpful. And then for the ultrasound, it's going to be a little bit more of an in-depth process, because you will need to take the images that with, you know, at your 7 skin fold sites, if that's the technique you're using. And then usually you would want to pull those off, and then in a different program, usually we'll use like an ImageJ analysis software, where you would measure that fat thickness layer, and then from there input it into your typical skin fold Jackson and Pollock equation, and then estimate percent body fat from that way.
Thanks for answering that. My audio works now. I switched devices.
Oh.
Thank you for that information.
Of course, yeah. And then let's see the difference between BIS and BIA. Yeah, so a bioelectrical impedance analysis is going to use a single frequency. Bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy uses multiple frequencies. And so they both measure total body water, but the additional frequencies gives you that ability to measure intracellular and extracellular fluid. And then from there, it uses what's called like a cold plot analysis, where it can give you your values based on the resistance and impedance as it flows through tissues to then calculate and estimate your body composition from there.
Is there any other questions out there? Well, if not, I guess we can, this is the part that Dr. Stock usually handles, but I believe what we'll end up doing is all the faculty to jump off and leave everyone else in the room, and you guys can ask questions and I encourage you, and I hope it's okay, Dr. Blue, but ask questions about PhDs, you know, new faculty, the experience. I know